with the Black culture in Nova Scotia to get to explore my personal heritage and to get to share that with all of you this evening. So for those who don't know me, my name is Andrew Paris. I recently started with the Canadian Sports Centre in November as the coach lead for equity, diversity, inclusion, and mentorship. Thank you for joining us in person this evening. It's been so long since we got to see so many faces. Huge thanks to the rugby team for coming and joining us this evening. Huge thanks to the team online for joining us this evening. What I'm going to talk about this evening is building an inclusive sport environment. We're going to actually just jump right into it, set the scene, and then we'll go from there. So just before we get started, so I'll do a quick land acknowledgement to acknowledge that we're in Mi'kmaq, the traditional ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people, where we are thankful to live, work, and play. As privileged advocates and agents of change, we recognize that we have the responsibility towards truth and reconciliation and to remain open and to suggestions and consultations, especially with the local Indigenous communities, on how we can repair harm and restore balance. And the thing that I like to really emphasize with land acknowledgements is it needs to be more than just words. There's a level of education that we need to do. There's a level of actual work that we need to do. So I encourage you all to take a look at the Truth and Reconciliation Report, specifically recommendations 87 through 91 that are specifically related towards sport. All right, so let's set the overview here, sit down why we're here. So the first thing we're going to do once we do some introductions is we're going to set the stage for a safe environment. We're going to talk about what is equity, diversity, and inclusion. They're very much buzzwords in today's society, especially since the murder of George Floyd. So we're going to talk about what is that. And then we're going to dive into what is bias, privilege, and allyship. And then we're going to go into the building the inclusive environment part once we sort of set the framework of where we're coming from. We'll talk about what to consider when working with historically marginalized communities, tips and tricks to creating a successful program, and then we'll open the floor to questions. If at any point the team online, if you have any questions, you can drop them in the chat. We'll try to answer them towards the end. Same thing with the group here in person. If we can hold off our questions towards the end, just jot a little note and whatnot. We'll try our best to answer them towards the end. Just a couple of housekeeping rule or notes for the team that's here in person. We have washrooms to my left or your right. We have some refreshments on the table here in behind us. And I believe that that's it. So I'm going to pass it over to Kirsty, who's just going to give a quick little introduction of herself.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. So my name is Kirsty. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the community coaching lead at Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic. So in short, my role is to support community coaches in Nova Scotia. And one of the programs that I work most with is our VIP program, which I recognize a few VIP coaches in the room tonight. It's nice to see you. Thanks for coming. And I'm also involved with our Safe Sport Working Group in Nova Scotia and our Women and Girls Task Force in Nova Scotia. So in terms of the EDI perspective, feel free to come talk to me after the session about any of those initiatives and how you can be involved or upcoming events. And then a little bit about me, it's kind of on the screen. I'm from Cole Harbour. I play ringette and coach ringette. I'm the current Canada Games coach for ringette for 2023. And some fun facts, I own a camp called Rise Ringette, and when I'm not in States, I'm in Carhartt renovating houses with my boyfriend and our dog who has matching Carhartts too. So it's a little bit about me, and I'm on tech duty tonight. So I'll see you guys after the session. Thanks.
Awesome, thank you, Kirsty. A little bit about me. My pronouns are he and him. I'm originally from Somerset PEI, but currently live in Truro. I've been coaching, working in sport, whether it's a volunteer or a paid professional, since 2006. Most people know me from my role in Curl. I was previously their technical director a few years back. I've since worked for provincial government, and now I'm here with the team at Sports Centre Atlantic. During my spare time, I'm the president and founder of a not-for-profit called the Black Rock Initiative. Our mission is to get more BIPOC youth into the sport of curling and also provide some education resources to the curling club to become a more inclusive space. And most importantly, my wife would slap me if I didn't mention this. I'm a proud husband and father of two. Kids want to keep me on my toes. So let's talk about just setting the environment here. Number one, we ask that you be present in the moment. So cell phones, if we can turn them off or put them on vibrate. If for whatever reason you need to take a call and need to step away, please feel free. This isn't school. You need to raise your hand and all that good stuff. We ask that this space be respected. So the content itself can be shared. If you want a copy of the presentation afterwards, my email, just my contact information is in the little red folder there. So if you did grab one, feel free to grab one on your way out or when we intermingle, or also my email address is there at the end. You would have seen it if you would have registered online. I ask that you be respectful of the responses or questions. A lot of times when we talk about equity, diversity, inclusion, as you may have seen on social media, it can devolve into a pretty dark and insulting area. We want to really try to keep this area respectful and be respectful of other people's opinions. I also want you to recognize your presence and encourage others. So if you're one of those people who are always raising your hand, asking questions, and really stepping up to the forum, that's awesome, and we encourage that. But if you see somebody next to you who's perhaps a little bit more shy, a little bit more introverted, leave some space for them to be able to use their voice and ask the questions that they may have. The biggest thing tonight is my job or my goal is to pull you outside your comfort zone. So if we look at coaching at its core, regardless of the sport, what we're trying to do with our athletes is we're trying to get them to step outside their comfort zone so that they in turn become better athletes, getting comfortable being uncomfortable. That's what I hope to do with the team here and the team online this season, is to have you step out of your comfort zone, to get comfortable being uncomfortable. That discomfort, typically that's something that sometimes we run away from. But tonight we don't want to run away from that. We want you to be able to embrace that. That's basically just what I mentioned earlier. So at times we experience discomfort. It's natural to experience that discomfort as you learn, especially when we're challenging established assumptions. The reality is, I'm going to go into this in a little bit. If we look at sport, sport is a construct that was created by white people for white people. That's a simple. I'm just going to be very blunt with that. So it does not mean that sport is this broken in this racist space. It means that in order to change some of the norms that have existed, it means stepping outside that comfort zone. So we're going to hop right into it. What I want to know, and we'll divide into some breakout rooms online, and we'll divide into some in-person breakout rooms here. Groups of about 4 or 5. I want to know, what does equity, diversity, and inclusion mean to you? So for the group team that's here in person, masks are recommended. They are not mandatory, as we all know, but we also ask to respect the person that you're in a small group with. So if they are more comfortable wearing their mask, then no judgment, rock masks, and the same goes vice versa as well. So we're going to divide up into groups of about 4 or 5. Introduce yourselves to the people in your group if you don't know who they are. And we're going to take 5 to 7 minutes and ask, what does equity, diversity, inclusion mean to you? The key word there is you. So there's not necessarily a wrong answer to that question. Does that make sense? Wonderful. Feel free to move the chairs around. We can always move them back later. So what does equity, diversity, and inclusion mean to you?
I never really thought about it like this, but I thought
I'm not a lawyer. So it's both from Ontario. I actually want to volunteer in high school.
I'm just gonna take a tech shot of you.
oh, okay. All my
Working
technology.
your butt doing the tech, so. Oh, get you to move your. There, tech shot.
Yeah.
One thing that I forgot to mention is we have Stu here this evening, who's taking some photos on behalf of one of our sponsors, Support for Sport. So he'll just be mingling around, grabbing the odd photos. If there is somebody here who absolutely does not want the photo taken, please by all means let me know during one of our breakout points or afterwards, and we can go ahead and make note of that. So I'm really curious to the group online. Please add into the chat. What does equity, diversity, inclusion mean to you? But to the larger room, please, what does equity, diversity, and inclusion mean to you?
Fair chance.
I like that. Fair chance. I like that. Anybody else?
Everyone belongs.
I really like that. We're going to talk about belong layer cutting and why that's important. Thank you for that.
Like simple meeting, simple people in different ways where it's systematically.
Exactly. I love that as well. That's one of the biggest things is that we're not necessarily looking to change the world or to completely change everything that is that you're doing, but we really want to show those who historically haven't seen sports, show them some support. And we also want to show that everybody belongs. We're going to talk about how they're all interlinked and how it comes back to belonging. Anybody else in the room here?
Opening the doorway for those who the doorway was once closed.
That's exactly it. I really like that. Again, it's not, like I talked about earlier, it's not that I think everybody in sport is inherently racist or discriminatory. It's really about making sure that the little Indigenous girl from Millbrook has the exact same sport experience and then the little white boy from Halifax. Because at the end of the day, there's really two questions that we have to ask about that. Number one, are we okay that they have different sport experiences? Because the reality is that there's some people in our society who are. And if the answer is no, what are we going to do to close that gap? Not necessarily eliminate that gap, because there are people, including some of the people that you see on posters around the room, who spent their entire lives trying to close and eliminate that gap. It's been trying to close and eliminate for thousands of years. But what can we do next week? What can we do next month? What can we do next year to make that gap a little bit smaller so that that little Indigenous girl has that exact same experience as everybody else? So let's take a deep dive into this. So we have diversity, inclusion, equity, and I'm also going to add in equality here. So look at these boxes here on the screen. Diversity is the practice of equality, or quality of including and involving people from a different range of social, ethical backgrounds, and different genders, sexual orientations, et cetera, et cetera. In order to achieve diversity, you need to be able to create a safe space. But with that said, you can be unintentionally diverse. For example, if we take a look around, not only are we diverse based on race, we're diverse based on gender, we're diverse based on ages, body shapes, so on and so forth. I didn't do this intentionally. I put a poster up on our website and invited everybody to come along. And lo and behold, we're diverse, but we're not intentional in that diversity. Having an open door to your sport program, to practice, isn't inherently enough. So, like I mentioned earlier, I come from the sport of curling, where there is a lack of diversity. Again, doesn't mean that curling is a bad sport, just means there's a lack of diversity in that sport. Too many times within that sport, when we start to have these conversations, there's a belief that if the door is physically open, and at some clubs, it's not physically open, it's actually locked, but that's another conversation for another time. If the door is physically open, it means anyone and everyone can come in. But when I step into a curling club, I look it onto the sheet of ice, and nobody there looks like me. And quite often what happens, even if I've been to that curling club before, I get a look of, what is it that black guy is doing? Right? That's not the experience that we want with somebody different. When somebody from a historically marginalized community comes into our sport, we want to be able to embrace it. We want to be able to create that sense of belonging that Catherine was talking about earlier. So if we look at this box, diversity is the what. So let's move on to inclusion. So inclusion is the effort and practices in which different groups have different backgrounds and are culturally and socially accepted and welcome. So if we look at it, inclusion is the how. So inclusion we use to achieve diversity. So again, in order to achieve diversity, you create that safe space by creating some inclusion. Inclusion is about being intentional. So not only, if you're trying to create an inclusive program, it might mean specifically reaching out to a specific group, whether it's a local Indigenous First Nations community, or if it's one of the historically Black communities that we have just down the road here, or if it's welcoming the new Canadians into our sport program. It's about reaching out. Diversity and inclusion, like I said, go along. I want to talk a little bit about that in the beginning, but there are different ways that you can go about being more inclusive. Starting with an inclusion policy is a I won't say an easy way to start, but it's a place to start. Talking about how we can be more inclusive to achieve that diversity is important. So if we look at Mark Connors, the goalie from the Halifax Hawks, who had racial slurs thrown his way, beat up. Mark is part of a diverse team. But the second those racial slurs get thrown at him, that's not an inclusive space. In fact, that's a dangerous space. In my mind, that's no different than if I was to take a hockey stick and chuck it at Kirsten. There's a danger. It might not necessarily be a physical danger, but Mark is no longer safe. So that's the idea of having a diverse space, but that space isn't necessarily inclusive. But if we look at that from a sport space, look at, say, soccer, a little girl with a hijab comes to practice, and the coach asks her to take off the hijab. Well, that's no longer an inclusive space. It might be diverse because she's there and there's different people there, but that's no longer an inclusive space. So the inclusion part is also very important to that. Then we go down to the bottom right here. So we're going around here a little bit, going around the square. So then we talk about equality. So equality is the state of being, the quality state of being equal. In short, it means providing everyone with the same amount of resources, regardless of whether everyone needs them or not. In order to achieve equality, we need to first achieve equity. And as I'm going to show here in a moment, not everybody necessarily needs the same amount of resources, and it's important to recognize that and move resources around accordingly. So then that takes us to our last box, which is equity, which recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocating the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. So equity is the work to achieve equality. So then we go from here over to here. So I really like little pictures, little diagrams. I'm a big fan of that. I should share my personal story versus always going through definitions. So diversity and inclusion go hand in hand. And I'm going to give you my one and only hot take for this evening. The reality is that diversity without inclusion is absolutely useless. It's everybody talks about achieving diversity. Really, I want to pivot that conversation around and talk about how can we achieve an inclusive environment? How can we achieve an inclusive space? Because like we talked about, diversity isn't necessarily enough. So like that little red ball there, that's been my curling experience for a good chunk of the time that I've been in the sport. So I'll give you a very quick story. When I was 14, living in PEI, got to come to the big city of Halifax for our curling Bonspiel tournament. First time getting to stay in a hotel, all that good stuff you can imagine. I'm pretty excited. We're in pre-game practice to figure out the ice and figure out the rocks. I go through my rock. It's just supposed to go just a hot one, so it's a light shot. Adrenaline pumping, I throw the rock too hard. As I'm sliding up the ice to chase my rock, the coach on the sheet next to me says, "That's why Black people don't curl." And he didn't use the term Black people. The reality is, in that moment, that's no longer a safe space for me. And that it's still a story that sticks with me today. And it's a lot of the reason why that I do the work that I do. Because when I first started in this space, it was how can I create a more inclusive space for my son? And it grew from there, it grew from there, and it grew from there. So that's an example of what I want to talk. So you can imagine that scenario on that little red ball. And at the moment, being a 14-year-old, everybody else around me looks like those white blocks. If we look at it from a different angle, we have diversity here, the puzzle pieces, they're all different, some are different shapes, some are different colors. But it becomes an inclusive space, an inclusive puzzle when we connect all of them together. It's all working together and working together as one. And of course, I'm sure you've seen this many times before. If we look at equality, taking the same resources, giving them to everybody, whether they need them or not, and then we take inequity, we give the specific amount of resources necessary so that everybody can achieve a true meaning of equality. The way I like to explain my job is helping coaches and sport administrators are the science of these boxes, whether they need to be wooden boxes or metal boxes, what kind of shapes do they need to be in, where exactly who needs what, and talking about the pros and cons of each, and having some in-depth discussions on why equity, diversity, and inclusion is important. So if we go back to our boxes here, one of the things that we've done is, we look at, we need inclusion to get to diversity. We need equality to be able to get to that inclusive space. And then equity is to work to create equality. And then to Kathy's point, almost as she saw in the presentation, we need them all to work together because it's one thing to show that those are welcome within your organization, within your sport. It's a whole other thing that they belong in your sport. And the reality is that anyone and everyone, regardless of where they come from, what they look like, they belong in sport. And once we fully understand that, that's when we can start to close that gap bit by bit, piece by piece. This is a bit hard to see, so if you want to close about it, we can I can email it to you later. This is from Dr. Sylvia Duckworth. This is her Wheel of Power and Privilege. Now, as a big Black guy, a lot of people think when I talk about equity, diversity, inclusion, I'm focused solely on race. And the reality is that's not true. So when we talk about marginalized group or historically marginalized groups, it runs across many different groups. So we can talk about gender, we can talk about ageism. So the reality is in sport, the way we treat seniors or those who are older is a bit different. Well, it's not a bit different, it's very different than how we treat youth within sport. And then we continue to go around. So how we treat those who are considered disabled or who have accessibility issues are completely treated different than those who don't. And then we continue to go around rural versus urban, Christian versus non-Christian. There's the race part, language as well, and even income. So those from low socioeconomic groups also play. So that's one thing to think about when we look at marginalization. Is we're not just talking about race, we're talking about a wide variety of groups. The other way to look at this too is to take a look at Dr. Duckworth's Wheel of Privilege and ask yourself, how close am I to the center, to the power? So if you are a white Christian male, chances are you have more biases and privileges than someone who is a BIPOC lesbian, just as an example. And we're going to jump into it in a moment, but it's really important for us to recognize our biases and privileges when we go to start to create that inclusive space. So there's a lot there. I apologize if you can't necessarily see it, but I'm more than happy to share this perspective. So by now, you know the guy on the screen. The reality is, so we have me on the far left in a suit. We have me in the middle with my son, who's only 14 and is as tall as me. That's another conversation for another time. And then we have me in a hoodie there. The reality is that for the most part, our biases and privileges affect how you treat that person on the screen before I even open my mouth, before I even approach it. So if I walk up the street in my suit, the reactions that I get, the way I'm treated is completely different than if I'm going for a run in my hoodie with my hood up like so. But as you can see, I'm still very much the same person. So with that as a bit of a backdrop, let's go into bias. So bias, the definition is it tends to believe that some people's ideas are better than others, which usually results in treating some people unfairly. There are a number of different types of biases out there. We're not obviously going to jump into them all tonight, but I do want to highlight on a few. So there's explicit bias, which is very much overt racism and discrimination. So if somebody was to walk in here right now and say, oh, there's a black person up there in front talking about how all white people are bad, we should really have a white person up there